Okay, we're unpaused on the ground at Tbilisi-Lucchini. I'm going to pull my checklist up. Now, on the default Kneeboard that comes with the F-5, we have a page that has weapon status and chapter and flare status, just telling us the settings that everything is set at. So we'll get into having a look at this in more detail once we get into weapons. I'm just going to get caught up here on my -1 and just start with, basically just start at the very beginning. I'll be right back. Okay, so we're caught up to the point of the pre-flight check. Now, this is going to include an exterior inspection, and even before the pilot gets into the aircraft, we have an optional check here. It says battery switch as required, and then operation of the static converter and fuel and oxygen quantity indicators may be checked at this point if desired. That sounds like a pretty good thing to do if I'm stepping up to an aircraft for the first time. So I'm going to turn the battery on just briefly. Okay, we can see that we have power on the, I saw some engine instruments kick to life there, so that's a good check of the static converter. Now I want to also check some quantities, so I come back here to a fuel and oxygen switch, and I'm going to position it down, and that's going to have my fuel quantity and oxygen quantity, and give me an accurate reading if it wasn't already. So my oxygen quantity, as you can see, is full. Fuel quantity, left and right. The left is going to start lower than the right, but that is a full fuel load, and once I burn off the fuel in the external tanks, as we saw, I think in the first video, we saw some details on that. That's going to drive me to start doing some fuel balancing. Now, the switch also has a forward position. This is just a test, so I'm going to position it forward. I can see the quantities for the fuel and oxygen coming down. I got the oxygen quantity light on, and yeah, I'll take that as a good test. And at that point, I'm just going to go battery off and press on. I'm just going to read through a lot of this stuff. If something occurs to me to point out, I will do so until we get into the startup. So I will be right back. Okay, so the exterior inspection called out by the tech order was very, very simple. Basically, it's just an aircraft walk around. I have the pitot tube up here on the front. I'm just making sure the cover is off and that it's clear of instructions. So here's the radome. I'll come on back past the guns to an AOA vane. This is what's going to tell the aircraft what the angle of attack is. Air is going to flow over this vane, and the vane is going to stay, parallel to the airflow while the aircraft moves around, and the position of the vane is what the aircraft's AOA is. So that is moving freely, and the cover is off. Now just look down the intake, making sure everything is clear. And a couple little interesting features here, I guess. You can see that the intake is sort of offset and extended out a few inches from the airframe. That's just to make sure that the air going down the intake is free from the boundary layer that flows along the airframe. You can also see here on the intake these little holes right here. What happens here is that air, and again it has to do with the boundary layer air, that air builds up on the surface, and that's not a good thing for an air intake. So air is actually sucked through these holes to cut down on the boundary layer and to increase the volume of air that actually makes it down to the fan blades that we can see down there at the end, and there's as much volume going in there as possible. Okay, so we'll continue on around. We can see the wing leading edge extension right here, this little piece of the wing that juts out. That's just there to give the aircraft actually a lot of additional lift. And then you can see the shape of the intake right there. It's that little Coke bottle shape or area ruling that allows the aircraft to go transonic and not get bogged down as much with shock waves. Okay, so we'll come on around and we have a single AIM-9 out here on the right side launcher. Now, as a loader, I would be checking a whole lot of stuff right here, but as a pilot, I'm just basically making sure that if the nose dome cover is off, that the IR dome right there on the front of it is not scratched or damaged. I might come up here and just check that the canards are secure. Now I would have a cable. This is where the AIM-9 cable would connect and interface between the seeker head and the aircraft itself. As the pilot, I would just simply, check that it's connected. As a loader, I would check that it's connected and that a little snatch away. It's called a snatch away, but it's technically, I think, an AIM-9 umbilical retainer assembly that is connected. So when the missile fires, that snatch away is going to pull the cable off the missile and retain the cable, so you don't have a big cable flopping in the air as the AIM-9 is flying forwards. And we can see the rocket motor arming key right there, or just the AIM-9 key, which is in the safe position right now. Okay, then back to the back on the tails, I would just make sure that the tails are secure, and then you can see on the tips, these are called roller-on assemblies. Now these are caged and held in position, but once the missile fires, those G-forces are going to release the roller-ons. And you see the little spinner right there. That's going to spin with the airflow, and then centrifugal force is going to act on the roller-on and help keep the missile stable in flight. So that's, why it's called a sidewinder. These roller arms just sort of move back and forth, stabilizing the missile as it flies, and that does, just due to the nature of it, make it sort of a sidewind, I guess, snake through the air. Okay, so we'll come up here to the wing root, and we see the little circular gauge right there. That's a gauge for the right side hydraulic reservoir, so if I can see fluid in there, I know that my hydraulic fluid level is where it needs to be. And then to the left, I can see these, I guess it's 7 little doors right here. This is the auxiliary air intake door. So once I get the startup going, we're going to see these open, and that's where the doors are. We keep coming around, and I've got my horizontal tails right there. Can look down the exhaust, checking for any obvious damage, and then just above that, we see this assembly. I'll kind of jump up here. Right here after the rudder, this is where the drag chute goes. So we can see that the door, in this case, is closed, but that is where it would be mounted. And then up here on the rudder, we have various antennas for the aircraft. And then the rudder itself, you can see, is offset a little bit once we get hydraulic pressure on the aircraft. All of these flight control surfaces that we see are going to center up. And then coming down here to the left side, same thing with the auxiliary air intake doors. We have the left side hydraulic fluid reservoir. And then right here, if we see the little symbol there, it looks sort of like an E. That's where electrical power would be connected, right behind that little panel, if we were going to use electrical power. And then down just below it, I'll sort of get out of my chair and crawl around on the aircraft real quick. Okay, so right under here, under this panel, just this side of the tail hook is where, for the engine start, bleed air is going to hook up. So there's a hose that would run from a low pressure air cart, hook up down here, and then that air is what's going to, in the engine start cycle, get the engine turning. So that's where that hooks up. And we see, of course, the tail hook down here. And I guess I kind of wandered from the walk around. I'm just doing my own thing right now. But yeah, part of the pilot's walk around would be to check that the pin is removed from the tail hook. And then as I look forward, I'll see how far down there I can crawl. Okay, so coming up here, we have the chaff and flare bucket. So we can see 2 dispensers right here, and the way that I have the aircraft configured right now is that I have one bucket, or I guess one container with flare, one container with chaff. Each flare container is going to carry 15, each chaff container carries 30. But this is the dispenser right there. This looks like it would be God, I would not want to be a loader or a maintainer on this aircraft. I am struggling to get around here, but if I come forward, now I'm forward of the speed brakes, and I can see the 250-gallon fuel tank right there mounted on a bomb rack on the centerline pylon. And there would be a safety pin installed right there just to the right of the triangle that would be removed as part of the aircraft launch procedure. So let me extricate myself from this situation, move a little bit forward. So of course we have the left-hand intake to check, and then we come down here to it's another air data sensor right down here. I would just make sure the cover is removed, it's clear of obstructions. And of course the main gear and the nose gear, checking for especially brake fluid, hydraulic fluid leaks. And I would also just make sure that the pins, I believe the pins are removed prior to engine start on this aircraft. So to get into the aircraft, I would either have a boarding ladder installed here on the left side, or probably more rarely, there's a ladder built in right there where you see step, just forward of the intake. I could open that door and a ladder would pop out, and there would be additional steps and handholds, and I would just climb on up there. Now, the manual also mentions behind the seat 4 switches to check, and I believe they would be right there. You can see them on the texture, but obviously there's no reason to model something like that. So that's where the 4 switches would be located right there, and you'll see that in the manual as we pop it back open. Okay, now let me climb back in the cockpit, and we'll get this thing going for real now. Okay, so we're on to the interior inspection. So once we hop back up into the cockpit after checking the external, it's basically just a check of the cockpit that flows from left to right, and checking switch positions for either off, safe, or the normal position for pre-flight. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through all this stuff once on my own. If anything occurs to me, or if I find any switches that don't match the position that's called out in the procedure and that we need to take some sort of action on, I will note that, but everything should be set up exactly the way that we need it right now. And I'm going to take my time on this one. It's something that would take me 20-30 seconds on an aircraft in the real world that I would be familiar with. But yeah, I'm going to take my time on this. I'll be back once I am ready to start throwing switches.